Things off. So good morning to all of you. Good morning, Brad Groper, Joseph Hardin, and Chris Hall. Thank you for joining us all from Long Meadow Ranch Wine Estates. We appreciate you taking time out of your day as we really start kind of evolving the return to our workplaces. In some areas, and others we're still in full shelter in place. So thank you for taking time out. Today we're going to focus on full circle farming here at Long Meadow Ranch Wine Estates. And with that, I turn it first to Brad Groper. Good morning, Brad.
Jeff, it is once again a pleasure to be hosting another webinar with you here today, and with our two special guests, actually two of my favorite people. One, because I love working with these guys. Two, because I always learn something from both these guys. And I hope you all next 30 to 45 minutes will learn something as well. First, I'd like to introduce you to Chris Hall, who needs no introduction as the proprietor of Long Meadow Ranch. Good morning, Chris. And our other guest is the man that keeps everything in the fields running, Joseph Hardin, who joined Long Meadow Ranch about a year before I joined. And it's been a pleasure working with him and being side by side and learning so much about our farming practices that go on. With that, I guess I will, as I said, no real introduction needed for Chris Hall, but having been with Long Meadow Ranch coming up on 5 years, the amount of information and knowledge, not only about the wine industry where I come from, but farming and restaurant running and cattle and chickens and olive groves and all that stuff that I've learned from Chris and Joseph, but Chris has been amazing. So having grown up here in Napa Valley and been involved in every facet, now running every part and every operation of Long Meadow Ranch, I'm going to make that introduction that I just did and pass it over to back to Jeff so we can talk about Joseph, and then we'll get Chris involved here to kick things off. So Jeff? Great.
Yeah, and so, a lot of people don't get to meet Joseph unless they come out and kind of take a nice walk with us on through one of the properties. And for me, that was one of the great days when I started the company, is walking through the vineyards and the land and going for a drive with Joseph. So Joseph, as our Director of Agriculture since 2014, he's behind the scenes on all the things that happen in the fields and the land, overseeing all the farming operations, vineyards, olive groves, fruits, vegetables, cattle, horses, chickens. And it's a real pivotal role that evolved at Long Meadow Ranch. And Joseph's been a quiet, steady, awesome leader in that, and is a great connector for all of us for what eventually ends up in the bottle, in the glass. So he also really is a big part of the conservation efforts that we do, and really overseeing some of these things that we do in the land that contribute to the whole at Long Meadow Ranch. And on top of that, his family goes back, I think it's fifth generation rancher you are, Joseph, in the Napa Valley, going back to the original Rutherford name comes from your family. So there's a history as well that Joseph brings, but it's what he does day to day in the present that affects not just today, but it affects the future of everything we're doing in our land. So with that, we're going to now kind of bridge the gap. I'm going to turn it to Chris. Maybe Chris, give us a little background on Long Meadow Ranch history, and specifically history within organic sustainable farming.
Sure. Some of you might be familiar with the history of Long Meadow Ranch or not, but it was originally founded in 1872 by a guy named E.J. Church. He farmed the ranch in both vineyards, orchards, with livestock from basically that time until Prohibition in the 20s, when he was unable to sell his fruit anymore because of Prohibition. So basically abandoned the property and sold it to a family from San Francisco who lived on the property from that time until my family came to Napa Valley in 1989. Between the Prohibition time and when we got there, the vineyards were no longer farms, so the forest grew back over everything, and as well as the olive orchards that he had planted at that time. So when we set out to do what we're doing today at Long Meadow Ranch, it was really the vision of growing Cabernet Sauvignon in a mountain environment. And Long Meadow Ranch has certainly turned out to be the perfect place for that. But the history of how we got to Long Meadow Ranch is also interesting. My parents, Laddie and Ted, started making wine in the garage in the early 70s while they were at Stanford University, and really became passionate about making some of those first wines from hillside fruit from the Santa Cruz Mountains. So when we were looking to do what we are doing now at Long Meadow Ranch, it was with the context of the mountain environment. So what Jeff's showing you here is a quick flyover of one of our Bear Canyon vineyards that's at the very top of our Mayacamas mountain Long Meadow Ranch property. That's the original one that was founded in 1872. So that vineyard that we just flew over was actually entirely forested when we got there. So we actually took back some of the second growth forest that had overgrown those original vineyard sites and replanted, starting with that vineyard that we just looked at, to Cabernet Sauvignon in the early 90s. So today we have more than just the Long Meadow Ranch estate on the Mayacamas Mountains. We're also farming vineyards and orchards and fruits and vegetables in Rutherford. We also have vineyards in Anderson Valley in the Mendocino Coast area. And more recently, we've began farming and operating at Stony Hill Vineyard, which is a historic Chardonnay producing site in the Spring Mountain District appellation. So we have many facets to what we do at Long Meadow Ranch, and that kind of comes full circle. We'll talk about full circle a couple of times here when we get through the presentations. But the concept of full circle farming really relates to how each different part of what we do touches every other part that we do. So from growing grapes to making wine, to growing grass for grass-fed beef and lamb, to growing olives for olive oil. We raise chickens for eggs. We have bees for honey. Of course, we grow fruits and vegetables, but each part of the system has an influence on different parts of that, meaning the second quality tomatoes might get fed to chickens that then produce the beautiful eggs that end up on the table at our restaurant or at people's homes who buy them from us at the local farmers markets. Or the manures from the horses or the chickens or the cattle get combined with the solid wastes from making wine and olive oil to produce our own estate fertilizers.
So Chris, can I ask you a question here? I just want to chime in and ask you a question. Everyone I think on here, and those of you who don't know, that everything that Long Meadow Ranch touches and grows is done organically.
Yeah.
Why organics? And at the time when you purchased Long Meadow Ranch, people looked at other people that were saying, oh, we're going to grow organically in 89, 90, 91, like you had, 3 heads. It's like, it's not viable, not possible. Can you touch on that for us a second?
There were very few people who were farming organically when we first got started, in vineyards in particular in Napa Valley. But that was really a vision that we had from the very beginning. My father grew up on a family farm in Western Pennsylvania, and my grandmother was a early pioneer of organic farming at the time. So that concept of quality and also the economic concept of being able to do it at a higher quality at a lower cost through these connected systems was something that we wanted to embrace from the very beginning. So from the initial plantings at Long Meadow Ranch all the way through what we're doing today, everything is organic. And that, of course, was before there was certifications. So we were one of the first vineyards in Napa Valley to become certified organic. And today all of our operations are certified organic by California certified organic farmers. When I was a kid, some of the elements of the system also came into play. We started growing fruits and vegetables kind of in the backyard scale of growing a few things. And I began going to the St. Helena Farmers Market when I was about 10 years old, selling big zucchinis and heirloom tomatoes and eggs from our chickens, and kind of like a kid's lemonade stand type operation. It was a little extra money in the summer, picking blackberries in the Long Meadow and other things like that. So progressively over time, these concepts, while they're important to our ultimate system of full circle farming, have kind of grown into commercial operations. from the from their early roots. So the kids lemonade stand, fruits and vegetable thing at the farmers markets evolved into us going to several local regional farmers markets, and of course growing all the fruits and vegetables that we can for our farmstead restaurant in St. Helena. I was in 4-H when I was a kid, so I raised pigs and chickens, and we had sheep and other things like that. And we also began raising highland cattle in the mid 90s on some of the upper pasture lands that we have at Long Meadow Ranch. So we started with just a few, and then began selling a little bit of it at the farmers market, and it was really wildly popular. So over time, we've grown our herds into several hundred head of both highland and shorthorn cattle that we crossbreed as well with Angus to produce the beef that we serve at Long Meadow Ranch Farmstead, and also take to the various farmers markets. So each one of these parts didn't just happen overnight. They weren't some new idea. We've been working on these for more than 25 years to get to where we are today. So Joseph's also obviously been working with us since 2014 and is the leader of all of the agricultural operations on the ranch. So he's responsible for making these systems work together, along with many other members of our team, and how they both are full circle from a farming perspective, but also, I guess, at your table at home or at our restaurant Farmstead.
Yeah, so that's a good chance now. So Joseph, your arrival in 2014 to this kind of complex, growing family operation. Tell us, like, when you came in, your perspective on organic farming, and then sort of the next layer of that, of the enlightenment of like being able to have such a wonderful, huge operation to steward, and aligning those values with Ted and Laddie and Chris.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was just an amazing opportunity to join the team. I had a very similar background to Chris. Grew up on a family cattle ranch with vineyards here in the Napa Valley, and shared a lot of similar childhood experiences. I was also at the same farmers market as Chris. We were selling pumpkins. So we did the same things as kids. We would, always outside working in the dirt. And flash forward, when I came back to the Valley after college, I had the opportunity to work for a couple family-owned, family-run places, always organic. And so, when the opportunity came up to join the team, it really dovetailed with the things that I'm really interested in doing. And so have the ability to step into such a diverse operation and understand how these benefits in the full circle farming really connect all the way through. And there's just so much we can come up with numerous examples. But some of the things that my mind goes to first is just, is it gives us the ability to be able to connect something all the way through that circle. And so as a cattle farmer growing up, historically, we would run a cow-calf operation. We would sell the cattle, but now we have the ability to carry that all the way to the plate. And the same thing with the fruits and vegetables, and that circle of understanding from growing the grape to, consuming the wine, really gives us an amazing ability to understand, the results of all our activities.
Nice. And so let's focus there. Let's kind of get into now some examples of that. So we've gotten the sort of the high level concept, and Chris, starting with you, I think back in all the conversations I've had with you and with Ted, and we talk about the olive orchard and how that was such a good contributing factor to our ability to work with full circle farming, to have the output of one become an input of another. And maybe you can kind of talk about that and lead into farming.
And in the early days, I think that was one of the initial examples of how those systems could work. So when we were considering building the first winery at Long Meadow Ranch, which our first vintage was 1994, my father and I were actually out on a horseback ride in what I was earlier describing as the forest that had overgrown the vineyards. And when we had initially come to Long Meadow Ranch, it was about making wine. We hadn't ever even considered or thought about making olive oil. So we're on a horseback ride somewhere where we'd always gone on a trail, and it became maybe more apparent after a few times, but that at least from the perspective of being higher, sitting on a horse rather than just walking, on the trail, you could tell that there was trees that were planted in the forest in more of like a grid-like pattern, and but otherwise in a forest of trees that were, a few of them 100-foot tall digger pines and other things like that. So we took some aerial photographs that we had of the property and looked a little bit closer, and you could actually see these grid-like patterns in those aerial photographs. And so when we went and kind of dove deeper into it, we discovered that we had 15-ish acres of historic orchards that were otherwise overgrown in the forest and had originally been planted at the same time as those original vineyards. So the olive orchards became a core part of what we were doing. When we started the design of the winery facility, we decided to integrate olive mill into the operation there. So we've been making estate-grown olive oils since about that same time. But the output of producing olive oil is also sanza, which is the solid material after you've milled and pressed the olives themselves into the olive oil. And it turns out that sanza, as well as a lot of vegetable water that are a part of that, are extremely high in nitrogen, and one of the highest levels of nitrogen that is naturally occurring in the environment. So when we combine those, the sanza waste from the olive milling process, for example, with the stems and the pumice from making wines, as well as with the manures from the horses or the chickens or the cattle, the input of in particular the olive sanza with its really high nitrogen content allows that composting operation to work really wonderfully, and also adds a high level of nitrogen back into that component. So when we fertilize all of the vineyards, the olive orchard component of the fertilizer is really an important part of how we have these high quality fertilizers that we're able to use on the Mayacamas estate.
And the olive oil process is basically concurrent to the end, usually to the end of the grape harvest. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, there's also this concept of year-round work for ourselves and our farm workers, and so we begin picking Sauvignon Blanc in August, maybe finish with Cabernet Sauvignon in October, and we move pretty quickly into picking olives in November before putting the ranch to sleep for just a short amount of time in December. So we're able to have these complementary seasons and also use the same winemaking facility for olive oil production, as well as the same tractors and a lot of the same picking bins and other tools and equipment. So there's a lot of synergies to olive farming and also growing grapes, of course, here, and that's the same reason why it's done all over the world.
You talk about having the same crew, and you talk about maybe a lull in December, but the fact is you've got winter vegetables going, and you've got the pruning, and then so the cycle, right, Joseph, is never ending.
Yeah, and there's of course plenty of maintenance on the ranch that needs to be caught up on at that time as well.
How do you cycle through the seasons, Joseph? Going from one harvest to the other and the planting of the next.
Well, I mean, it's all about planning, but then you can't fall in love with your plan. You have to be in the field making real-time decisions. And so, you separate things into things that we need to do this week and things that could wait till next week. And so it's always kind of this leapfrog, because as you mentioned a second ago, sometimes we get, our energy gets diverted or redirected into the vegetable operation for peak harvest, or, we might, transition. So there's a lot of fluid transitions. And so having a team of people that are highly skilled who can, understand each of the different things from olives to vineyards to fruits and row crops, orchards, that's where the magic is having people who are, seasoned veterans and experts on all these different tasks that we have to take on for our full circle farming.
Yeah, the retention rate that you have on the farming team, the vineyard team in general, that whole team, how important is that, the longevity of the people that have worked for Long Meadow Ranch? How important is that in your overall operation?
It could be the most important thing. I mean, as I mentioned, we have a different job offer than most standard vineyard operations do in the Napa Valley. So we look for people who are, have a diversified skill set also. And it takes at least one season to see everything once. And so having people who have been here, some of our veterans have been here 20 plus years. and they're the ones that lead the teams and provide that ongoing education as we switch between crops, between seasons, react to weather events.
Great.
Nice. So now let's pivot this to the growth we've had at Long Meadow Ranch. Right, Joseph, right when you joined, about less than a year later, Anderson Valley, this Anderson Valley estate came into our world, and an incredible development that Chris shepherded in finding this amazing vineyard up there near Philo. We had the chance to convert to organic immediately, and sort of actually even a little bit earlier. And we then did it again with Stony Hill. But let's talk about organic conversion and a little bit of give us some a little summary of how we go about doing that and how quickly you're also seeing results in the energy, the life, and the quality.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that one. For me, it's been a great project. I really, when we first started working up in Anderson Valley, just a really amazing, beautiful vineyard, and it has just endless potential. And so as you start to be introduced to something for the first time, you start to kind of in your mind evaluate what are some things we can do better. And for us, the natural first step was the conversion to organic farming, which is a subtle change. Not as much as you would think. It takes, the process in total will take you 3 years to convert an existing vineyard into one that's certified organic. And so essentially it's just replacing all non-organic inputs with organic ones. And for us on the ground, the biggest change would be in the way we treat the soil. And so a lot of the differences between a conventional and organic agriculture is how we treat the strip of grass that's underneath the vine row. And so we're really focused on cover crops and using our mechanical cultivators. And then also a lot of it's just timing too. We have to make sure that we're hitting all of our intervals for cultivation or for our canopy work. And so the results are great. I mean, the vineyard's health has been increased dramatically. I think what we're looking at in this picture here is the improvements that we had with our composting program. And so as we start to layer in some of these subtle inputs, compost is something that takes typically 3 years to show its results. And so it's a lot of what we do is more of a long-term vision, a long-term mindset that we want to be stewards of this vineyard and keep it in its best shape for another 25 years.
Nice. And Chris, adding to that, sort of going back to those days when you found this vineyard, the opportunity, can you speak a little bit to that also in terms of that vision for the future?
I started looking at this vineyard in early 2014. It's just, as the crow flies, maybe 8 or 10 miles from the Pacific Ocean in the deep west end of the Anderson Valley in Philo. It's about 70 acres planted to vineyard, which is a really unusual size vineyard in Anderson Valley. There's a lot of smaller family-owned, single vineyard sites, but this one was particularly interesting because it was of a larger scale. It had a broad variety of clonal selections of Pinot Noir, different slopes and exposures to the sun, a little warmer, a little cooler, and then also 3 different distinct soil types. So the vision was to be able to produce expressive, a couple of different variations of expressive Pinot Noirs from the same site, from the same vineyard, and the majestic kind of character of this vineyard is also something that grabs you pretty quickly when you're there. I mean, you can see in this photo, the mountain in the background is all in part Henry Wood State Park, which is all old growth redwood trees. So the backdrop, of course, is quite nice, but the evolution of this vineyard from when I first got there to what it even in this photo looks like today is pretty dramatic. The organic transition has, like Joseph was describing, been one that we make to the entire vineyard. We farm the vineyard and the soil, not just the vines on them by themselves. So you want to see healthy cover crops. You want to see healthy vines. All of that works together and means that the soils and the vineyard as a whole is being farmed, which contributes to the quality and the quantity of the fruit that we're able to get. So from the early days of the conversion at the Anderson Valley estate, we've we've seen yield improvements, quite dramatic yield improvements, quality improvements, and then also we've been able to learn a lot about the site to be able to produce these varying expressions of Pinot Noir that we do. So, you know, when I first got there and when I introduced Stéphane Vivier, who's our winemaker, to this site as well, we both had this idea of making an expression of Pinot Noir from the beginning to the end of the varietal, but from a single site and from a single vineyard. So today we make, for example, a Pinot Noir Blanc, which is, you know, similar to the base wine of a sparkling Blanc de Noir. We're also doing a Blanc de Noir. We make a rosé of Pinot Noir. We make a Brut rosé from the Pinot Noir. We make a Pinot Noir from all the blocks in the vineyard. That's a blend of the entire estate. And then we make two single bottlings of Pinot Noirs that are from two of the specific soil series and exposures that I was describing. One's called Perry Gulch and another one's called Pinole. And then also we've been experimenting to making basically a brandy of Pinot Noir, which is similar to what they do in Burgundy, Amar. So eventually we'll also release that. But we've been making the sparkling wine since 2016 in the traditional method champenois, and those were on the lees for about 3 years and disgorged in January or February. And so this is actually the first time where we've, in the last month or so, been able to sit down and have a tasting where you're actually, by vintage, able to taste the entire 2016 vintage, for example, from the beginning to the end of the expression of that site and of the varietal of Pinot Noir. So it's really exciting to have been able to have done that. And our farming practices are an important part of our ability to get expression and quality and diversity out of the site.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything benefits. You know, if you take care of the land, everything has a benefit across that line. And I think that's a good way to look at it, seeing the whole 16 vintage. So there's two other things I want to touch on today. One is also the conversion to organics at Stony Hill. I want to use a couple of examples. And then I also want to go up to Bear Canyon to show, and Joseph, we've talked about this a lot, and Chris, we have as well, Brad, about true sustainability, right? It's not just how we're farming in the soil today, but it's the long-term vision of looking at that. So first I'm going to show, while we're on the conversation of conversion, I'll throw a few Stony Hill images up and we can talk about that project that's ongoing right now over these last 2 years. Maybe you can speak to that, Joseph, as I pull these up.
Yeah, Stony Hill it's still a very exciting project. I mean, the vineyards are historic, well known throughout the Napa Valley for producing exceptional Chardonnays. And for us, you know, stepping in from the farming side, it was just another great opportunity to understand what we can do with these vineyard blocks. And, you know, from our first conversations, we're trying to understand, you know, which direction do we want to take our farming up there? And so, you know, we came through and established kind of a 10-year kind of snapshot of where we want to be 10 years from today. And so a lot of the vineyards were in great shape. You know, they're, you know, didn't need very much, some small minor improvements. You can see from the picture, old wooden post, you know, just a lot of little kind of small improvements to the existing vineyards was our first focus. And then our secondary focus up there originally was to redevelop some of the fallow vineyards. So the total vineyard acreage is right around 42 acres, and there's currently about 6 or 7 acres that are fallow. And so it's a different process to redevelop an empty field. And so we're kind of doing those on a parallel path where we're putting energy both to redeveloping and bringing up online vineyards that aren't in existence, but also putting a lot of our energy and thought into, you know, maintaining these old historic vineyards. Some of them, the oldest Riesling block that we're looking at in the back end of the picture was planted in 1948. And so every vine is slightly different. And so we're trying to bring a little bit more uniformity into it. And so an example of some of our conversions in the foreground here is, you know, we converted the pruning style of this vineyard back to a historic kind of head trained vine, the way it was pruned, you know, 20 or 30 years ago. And so there's a lot of different ways, obviously, to trellis a vineyard. And so up there, we have different styles of wine that are derived from our trellising and our care of those different sub-blocks of vineyard.
This property, majority of the property, or maybe all of it, is dry farmed except for new plantings, right, Joseph?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing that my eye goes to right away in this picture is there's no drip hose. And so it makes things a little bit more challenging. If you look through the picture, I'm sure you'll see a stake that doesn't have a vine on it. And in that case, you know, we have to take a different approach to reestablishing a replacement vine in there. And so we'll plant a rootstock. We let it grow for a full season in the field. We'll graft it the following season. And what I'm trying to highlight is it takes a little bit longer to do it that way, but that's what we need to do because we can't. I mean, the other option would be to go out there with a bucket of water, but on this scale, it's not really an option. So a lot of long-term planning goes into every one of our day-to-day activities.
Nice.
Great.
And Brad, I'm going to turn to you to kind of shepherd this next part of the conversation because you spent a lot of time with Joseph. I'm going to pull up that photo of Bear Canyon, but I want to talk about this, you know, and Chris, you can tap into this as well.
Yeah.
And speaking of the long-term sustainability of vineyard planning and continuing the life of a vineyard beyond its first 25 years.
Yeah, this is this takes me back to some other a conversation that you and I have been involved with Jeff over the years, which when we were in Slovenia and we were talking about Pinot Grigio, most people are ripping their vines out at 15 and 20 years. And that's only when Movia begins to put it into his wine. This, in this particular case, is a very reminiscent story for me, which is, you know, while you're making great Cabernet up in that Bear Canyon, Chris and Joseph and the team looked at what they can do to improve it or whether they should replant. And I'm going to pass it to Joseph and Chris here to talk about the decisions that were made in the 2 or 3 year experiment in this vineyard to see whether or not you could make an adjustment or you needed to replant. So I guess I'll start with Chris on that in that initial discussions.
Sure. This is a really nice photo too. At this time of year, you can see that there's this like wonderful clover ground covered cover crop that is, you know, a great example of a vineyard that's been farmed organically since the very beginning. We have a wonderful ecosystem of beneficial insects and a healthy cycle of perennial cover crop. It's really, of course, important in mountain-grown vineyards, but it's also really so that you avoid erosion, but also really important to the soil health. And so you can see the uniformity of the cover crop, for example, which really shows you the uniformity of the farming of the entire vineyard in an organic kind of and sustainable practice way. And so, you know, this vineyard was planted in the early 90s and was the first planting we did at Long Meadow Ranch. And maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago, the vineyard, you know, is getting to be 20 plus years old. And as vineyards of that age might begin to not necessarily decline in quality, but the vines might start reducing their quantity of volume of fruit. And so we saw that beginning to kind of crest at that point in time. And as Brad was describing, a lot of conventionally farmed vineyards or others would consider, well, maybe it's time to begin a phased replanting of these sites so that we can maintain our volumes of production from those locations. But there was really no reason to do that. The vines were extremely healthy, not showing any issues with their age or their health. So we wanted to experiment with some just adjustments in the vineyard and in the pruning techniques to be able to see if we could bring the yields back to what they had been a few years earlier. So maybe Joseph, you can talk about the conversion to the cane pruning in the Bear Canyon vineyard.
Yeah, yes. I think one of the other things to highlight about this vineyard is how special it is because of the source of the budwood. It comes from a historic vineyard here in the valley, and it was something that you can't get your hands on anymore. So we knew we had something very special to start with, and then we needed to maintain it. And so, you know, as all good experiments start, we decided to start with 4 rows in the vineyard, and we decided that, you know, one of the limitations to the vines was the permanent structure. So they were spur prune vineyards. You know, trunk comes up, makes a T, and you have your spurs up. And through, you know, 25 years of pruning that vine, there was a lot of issues in the plumbing of the vine. And so it's understood that, what we did is we basically got back to the head of the vine and the trunk and laid out a cane. And so it's a multi-step, multi-year process. And so for the first year, we converted 4 rows to cane pruning. We had to wait a season to pick the fruit, and then we started to evaluate it as a wine. And so we did trials and followed the experiment all the way into the cellar, where we made 2 identical batches of wine, and then did a blind tasting to evaluate our results. And the winemaking team and the farming team agreed that it was an improvement in a direction we want to take. And so then the next season we took a second pass at redeveloping some of the vines, and we did half the block one year, and the following year we did the other half of the block. And so that was a conversion just to get us to the cane pruning, but the conversion to get the vines back lower, and lower for the reason we want to keep the fruit in a very uniform kind of area on the vines. It's an ongoing process. And so I think it's probably going to take us 3 or 4 years to really get the vineyard, back to being uniform the way we want to see it. And so it's really going to be a 10-year project from start to finish, but really happy with the vine health. They're just great old vines and got a really long future in front of them.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the core of it, is that I think we've extended the commercial life of this vineyard by perhaps another 20 years through this choice of experimentation and slight changes to our farming approach to the same site in these historic vines.
Nice. And as a reference, everyone, that vineyard was the vineyard we saw in the flyover in the beginning of that drone. So we're up there about 1,100 feet up. I know that picture doesn't really show because it's that plateau vineyard, but I think that brings it back to how we started today in showing you the original estate. So with that, I want to allow some time for some questions, or either from one of us for Joseph, or Brad, you have a question?
No, I have a question. This is a question that I think is pertinent to today, which I think I hope maybe most of us are all kind of wondering right now at this stage of the game. Joseph, can you touch upon farming in today's pandemic and what that means, and any lessons that you've learned from any Southern Hemisphere harvests that have taken place?
Yes, I mean, so for us in the field, things changed drastically like everyone else in March. And we had to rethink the way we took on each and every task in the vineyard. And we've, made great progress and developed a really safe place to work. But our next steps are going to be to do the same thing under the harvest circumstances. And so we have the ability to lean on some of our grape growing people down in the Southern Hemisphere. That in Australia and New Zealand, they just finished up with harvest. And so we have the ability to learn from them how they were able to safely get through harvesting the grapes. For us, it's a slightly different situation since we're hand harvesting. And so, we're roughly 2 months away from our first Sauvignon Blanc pick. And so we're already actively thinking about and discussing how we're going to be able to make that all happen. And, yeah, so it's a work in progress.
You brought up a point, because I'm wearing glasses. Yes. And I know that when I put a mask on and I'm trying to do something, my glasses fog up. So you said, because we talked about, will the vineyard workers, because we harvest generally at night, right? And so it's cooler temperatures, so the mask isn't as oppressive as it is during the day when it's 80, 90, 100 degrees here. But the glasses do create that problem.
Well, that's why we have to take each one of these issues as they rise in real time in the field. I mean, we can do our best to plan for it, but it's not going to be one easy answer for everybody. A person with glasses might have to get a different type of mask that works well with them. And so we're still very much in the planning phase, but it's not going to hold us back. We'll find a way to get the grapes to the winery on the right day.
And Chris, you've taken significant measures to look out for the safeguard of all the employees of, Farmstead and Long Meadow Ranch and stuff. In the cellar, I know that you've also made some adjustments and moves. And if you want to touch base on that with the winemaking team and the crew there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, there's the obvious protocols which have all been in place since the beginning, but there's also additional layers of how you can approach this. So one of those is that we're working in pods or in groups, in particular in the cellar, so that you know, 2 people work a day together, and then the next day or the next location that they're going to work, they'll continue to work together, and on a different day of the week, perhaps a different 2 people work together. So we're trying to minimize the crossover between those teams when you're working in a closer environment in the cellar, so that we have the opportunity to limit those potential exposures, for example. But, you know, at our restaurant, where we see a lot of the public, we first of all, we never closed. We stayed open this entire time for to-go and delivery, and so through that period, we were able to learn a lot internally about how to work well in the kitchen or inside the restaurant, with appropriate protocols in place, and also that in ways that made it that everybody was comfortable with. So having that time to be able to do that, rather than having been closed and then just opening up and trying to figure it all out in a short amount of time, really was valuable. And so obviously the face covering protocol is one of the most important ones. So similar to everywhere else, face masks are required to be on the property at the restaurant at Farmstead when you're not at your table. And we put a very robust health and safety protocol in place that's extremely transparent to anybody making a reservation, and or when you arrive on the property, you have to check in through the host stand, which is outdoors, to be seated at your table. So so far, this all seems to be smooth, and we haven't had any issues with guest feedback on that. So I think it's going as good
Yeah,
as you could
you
expect.
pivoted really well in the layout of at the Farmstead restaurant, and utilized all the beautiful outdoor space that we have there. One last question that I have, and unless somebody else has something else coming up, but Joseph, what's the vintage look like so far? What's the fruit set and all that stuff look like, which we have something to look forward to?
I'm very optimistic. I really am. I think that we have a great crop out there. You know, we've come off of 4 or 5 good quality and quantity vintages, and it looks just to be maybe a little bit less than last year, but it looks great. I mean, we're real happy going between all the different white and red varieties. Pretty even. We had some, Brad's alluding to, we had some scary weather throughout our bloom this year when the grapes were flowering and right before they set their berries, and somehow we threaded the needle. It you know, and things set great, and so, you know, it gives us some time to really, you know, do our final touches on the canopy, and then a little adjustment on the crop, and then we're ready to pick in 2 months.
60 days.
I can do math. Thank you. Yes, it's coming up
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah, that's good. 2 + 2, Joseph.
Yeah.
Nice.
Great.
Well, everyone, we are at 45 minutes of spending time with you today. Joseph and Chris, we appreciate the time you spent sharing stories and nuggets of great information on our full circle farming at Long Meadow Ranch Wine Estates. And Brad, always a pleasure to do this with you. And everyone out there, again, you can share this. We'll send you a YouTube link tomorrow. And if there's no final questions, any final sign-offs, my final sign-off is thank you. We appreciate you and your support of Long Meadow Ranch. We want you to stay healthy, and look forward to seeing you one day soon.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Brad and Joseph, and everybody else.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone's time.